This story starts with a researcher named John, who is being interviewed on a major news channel. The interviewer asks John about a recent powerful earthquake in a city. The way the earthquake's intensity was measured was unusual, and John is questioned about his thoughts on it and why these earthquakes are suddenly happening. John responds by saying that humans cannot control such events, but he and his team are working on ways to manage earthquakes. Until then, people must focus on staying safe and protecting themselves. He explains that earthquakes are natural disasters that humans currently have no control over. After some time, we see another man named Chris being interviewed at the same place. The reporters treat him with great respect because Chris is the person who saved many lives during the earthquake. People see him as a hero. However, Chris knows something that he hasn't told anyone. He is afraid that if he speaks about it, people might laugh at him or not believe him, so he keeps it a secret. During the interview, Chris answers all the questions carefully and gives the right responses. Then we learn a little about Chris's personal life. He was married to a woman named Sarah, but after many years together, their marriage is ending. Sarah has filed for divorce, and they are separating. Chris and Sarah have 2 children, Sam and Julia. The hardest part for Chris is that Sarah has full custody of both kids, so they live with her in the city. Since the divorce, Chris has been completely alone. He tries to live a normal life, but deep inside, he feels lost and lonely. One day, Julia started missing her father, so she decided to visit him. When she arrived, Chris was overjoyed to see her, but also felt worried. The city where he lived was known for frequent earthquakes and tsunamis, making it a dangerous place. For now, Chris put his worries aside and happily took Julia home. Julia was young, but she had a sharp mind and a high IQ. When she walked into one of the rooms, she noticed that Chris had put up many photos on the walls. These were pictures of different people, but she didn't recognize any of them. Curious, Julia asked her father about the photos. Chris explained that these were all the people who had lost their lives in the earthquakes and tsunamis. He had been there trying to save as many as he could, but sadly, he couldn't save them all. Deep inside, Chris blamed himself for their deaths. Julia, however, understood that it wasn't her father's fault. She knew that no one could control natural disasters and that the people who passed away were simply caught in a tragedy that was beyond anyone's control. But no matter how much she understood, Chris still couldn't stop thinking that he should have done more to save them. Chris had a great time with his daughter, Julia. He enjoyed every moment with her, but he knew the city was too dangerous. With frequent earthquakes and tsunamis, he didn't want to put her life at risk. Even though it was hard, he decided it was best to send Julia back to her mother, Sarah. The next day, Chris followed through with his decision and sent Julia home, knowing she would be safer there. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a man named Sel was entering a strange tunnel. Sel was a researcher who had recently discovered some important information. He had come to the tunnel to confirm his findings, but before long, a powerful earthquake struck. Sel had already gone deep inside, and he quickly realized what was about to happen. The ground shook violently, and in an instant, the entire cave collapsed. Sel and his companion had no way to escape. Trapped under tons of rock, both of them lost their lives, buried beneath the rubble. The next day, the news reported the tragic accident, confirming that a man named Sel and his companion had lost their lives. Later, it was revealed that Sel was actually an old friend of Chris. The news of Sel's death deeply saddened Chris. He couldn't understand why these earthquakes were happening so frequently and with such high intensity. Then Chris received a parcel. To his surprise, it was sent by none other than Sel before his death. Curious and anxious, Chris quickly opened it to see what was inside. The package contained Sel's research findings, detailed reports about earthquakes and tsunamis. Realizing the importance of the information, Chris began reading carefully. According to Sel's research, a magnitude 6 earthquake had been detected near the cave, and it had happened suddenly, causing massive destruction. But what shocked Chris the most was Sel's final conclusion. His investigation showed that a much larger earthquake, one exceeding a magnitude of 10 on the Richter scale, was likely to strike the city. This disaster could cause unimaginable destruction and take countless lives. Sel had warned that immediate action was needed to evacuate everyone before it was too late. Panic set in for Chris. His wife and children didn't live far from the danger zone. If the earthquake hit, their lives could be at risk. Determined to act, Chris gathered all the reports and knew he had to alert the authorities. He had to get this information on the air and push for an evacuation before it was too late. Without wasting a moment, Chris rushed to the private organization where he and Sel had once worked. Chris met John, the manager at the organization, the same man who had given the interview at the beginning of the story. Without wasting any time, Chris handed over all of Sel's reports. He explained how Sel had investigated the earthquakes and discovered that extremely high-magnitude quakes were about to strike soon. He also told John that the cave where Sel died had collapsed because of one of these powerful earthquakes. However, John remained calm and explained something else to Chris. He spoke about the organization's advanced technology, saying they had a machine that could detect earthquakes before they happened. He also mentioned that they were very close to developing a system that could control seismic vibrations, which would eventually allow them to stop earthquakes altogether. Then John dropped another shocking statement. He told Chris that Sel hadn't actually died because of an earthquake. Instead, construction work had mistakenly started near the cave, and an explosion from that site had caused the collapse. According to John, Sel's death was just an accident, unrelated to the earthquakes. In other words, John dismissed all of Sel's research, calling it useless and irrelevant. Chris, however, wasn't convinced. Something didn't feel right. He couldn't believe that Sel had been wrong, especially after seeing the detailed reports himself. Determined to find out the truth, Chris decided to investigate further. When Chris arrived at Sel's house, he was greeted by Sel's daughter, Mary. She had known Chris for a long time, so she trusted him and led him to her father's room. As Chris stepped inside, he noticed something unusual. Sel had collected many different types of stones, neatly arranged all over the room. It became clear that Sel had been studying earthquake-prone areas by analyzing magnetic fields and other geological factors. As Chris examined Sel's research, a shocking realization hit him. His own family was living in one of the high-risk zones. He had never considered that possibility before, and now, knowing the danger they were in, he felt a deep sense of urgency. Wasting no time, Chris immediately called John and asked for the contact information of the construction contractors working in that area. He needed to warn them and ensure that they evacuated the site as soon as possible to prevent another tragedy. Now that Chris had all this crucial information, he knew he had to tell his family as well. Even though they no longer lived together, he still felt responsible for their safety. Chris rushed to his ex-wife Sarah's house, where he found his son Sam happily spending time with his girlfriend. Seeing his son so cheerful brought a brief moment of relief, but Chris wasn't there for small talk. He needed to warn Sarah about the coming danger. However, when he tried to tell her, Sarah quickly changed the topic. She wasn't interested in discussing earthquakes or risks. Instead, she told Chris that their daughter Julia had a dance competition that evening. She invited him to come and watch, saying that Julia would be thrilled to see him there. For a moment, Chris forgot about everything else. The thought of seeing his daughter happy, dancing on stage, filled him with joy. He had been so caught up in danger and disasters that he hadn't taken a moment to just enjoy being with his family. Smiling, Chris agreed. Sarah was at Julia's school when she told her, "Your father is coming to watch your dance today." Hearing this, Julia was overjoyed. She had been excited to perform, but now knowing that her father would be there, she was even happier. Meanwhile, Chris was deeply focused on studying Sel's research. He carefully examined the reports that identified earthquake-prone locations. He needed more answers, so he went back to Sel's house, hoping to find something useful. While there, he insisted that Sel's daughter, Mary, take him to the tunnel where her father had died. At first, Mary refused. She hated that place because it had taken her father's life. But after Chris pleaded with her multiple times, she finally agreed. Together, they entered the tunnel. Chris carefully examined the area where Sel had been last seen. As he searched, he noticed some stone samples lying nearby. They weren't buried under rubble. Instead, they seemed to have been deliberately placed there, as if someone had been trying to collect them. Sensing their importance, Chris picked up the stones and decided to take them for further research. But he also knew they couldn't stay in the tunnel for too long. It was too dangerous. Without wasting time, he and Mary hurried back to the car and drove away with the stone samples. While driving, Chris suddenly received a call from Sarah. She reminded him, "Julia's dance show is about to start. You need to get to the opera house as soon as possible." Chris froze for a moment. He had completely forgotten about Julia's performance. He had been so caught up in his research that he lost track of time. This was exactly why Sarah had divorced him in the first place. Chris had always been so focused on his work, always chasing answers, that he had neglected his family. Chris assured Sarah that he was on his way, but before he could reach, the entire city's electricity suddenly went out. Everything was plunged into darkness, as if a massive short circuit had occurred. Then out of nowhere, a small earthquake struck near the opera house, where Sarah and Julia were. The impact was strong enough to shake the entire building. Many people lost their lives, and Chris heard the chaos unfold over the phone. Realizing the danger, he rushed toward the opera house as fast as he could. Meanwhile, inside, Sarah ran through the damaged building, desperately searching for Julia. To her relief, she found Julia hiding safely in a corner. That small decision had saved her life. Without wasting a second, Sarah grabbed her daughter and quickly took her to a safe place. Chris arrived at the scene with Mary, trying to contact Sarah. When he finally reached her on the phone, she told him that she and Julia had made it home safely. Though relieved, Chris felt a deep sense of guilt. Once again, his work had kept him from being there for Julia. He had missed her dance performance, and now a disaster had unfolded. At the opera house, Chris noticed John and his team investigating the damage. The pillars of the building were severely cracked and broken, and they were closely examining the structure. Chris went straight to John, demanding answers. What caused this earthquake? Why didn't your systems detect it? But John, trying to protect himself and his team, denied that it was an earthquake at all. Instead, he blamed the opera house's poor construction, saying that the entire structure relied on just a few weak pillars. According to him, even a small tremor would have caused it to collapse. He refused to admit that his team had failed to predict the disaster. Chris saw through John's excuses, but chose not to argue. Instead, he left and headed straight to Sarah's house. When he arrived, he saw Sarah in tears, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Their daughter had barely escaped with her life, and the thought of what could have happened was too much for her to handle. Chris approached Sarah and, for the first time in his life, apologized to her. He had always cared deeply about his family and wanted to be with them, but his work had always gotten in the way. Sarah saw the sincerity in his words and understood his feelings. She hugged him, comforting him. For the first time in a long while, Chris felt a sense of relief. Sarah was finally trusting and supporting him again. The next day, Sarah went to work at the hotel where she was a receptionist. She looked happier than before, feeling like her husband was back in her life. Meanwhile, their eldest son, Sam, was busy attending lectures at his university. At the same time, Mary was at home, going through her father's laptop when she stumbled upon a folder containing strange experiment videos. The videos showed mice being exposed to something unusual, and what she saw disturbed her. Without wasting time, Mary called Chris and asked him to come over. When Chris arrived, she showed him the footage. He watched carefully and quickly realized something shocking. All the mice had died due to exposure to some kind of gas. Looking closer, Chris identified the cause. The explosion had released a dangerous mix of gases, including carbon dioxide and other toxic substances, into the air. At that moment, he finally understood what Cell had been trying to warn them about. The earthquakes and landslides weren't just causing destruction on the surface, they were also releasing poisonous gases trapped underground. If those gases had killed the mice so quickly, then humans and animals wouldn't survive either. Chris knew what had to be done. The entire city had to be evacuated immediately. If they didn't act fast, everyone would be at risk of dying from the invisible, deadly air spreading around them. For now, Chris took his younger daughter Julia and Mary and drove straight toward a safe place. At the same time, he kept trying to call his elder son, Sam, who was attending lectures at the university. However, Sam didn't take his father's calls seriously. He ignored them and continued focusing on his work. But Chris knew he couldn't leave Sam behind. He had to fulfill his duty as a father and save not only his son, but also all the students at the university. With no other choice, Chris made a desperate decision. He called the police and falsely reported that multiple bombs had been planted inside the university. He knew this would force an evacuation and save the lives of all the students, including Sam. After making sure the university would be cleared, Chris rushed to the hotel where his wife Sarah worked. When they arrived, he told Julia to stay near the car while he ran inside to find Sarah. But Julia, feeling scared and alone, didn't want to be left behind. Ignoring her father's instructions, she quietly followed him inside. Chris finally found Sarah and urgently explained everything to her. He told her that a massive earthquake was about to hit and they had to leave the city immediately. Realizing the danger, Chris activated the hotel's fire alarm system to evacuate the building as quickly as possible. With Sarah by his side, Chris headed toward the ground floor using the elevator, planning to grab Julia and leave. However, neither of them knew that Julia had also entered the hotel. Then suddenly, disaster struck. The entire city's power went out, plunging everything into total darkness. The elevator came to a sudden stop, trapping Chris and Sarah inside. They panicked, unsure of how to escape. Julia standing still, staring at something in the distance. She had noticed something terrifying. Just beyond the city skyline, a monstrous earthquake was beginning. The ground was shaking violently, and the magnitude on the Richter scale was so high that it seemed capable of destroying everything in its path. For the first time in their lives, Chris, Sarah, and Julia witnessed such massive destruction with their own eyes. Skyscrapers were collapsing like fragile straws, and deep cracks tore through the ground. The once bustling city was turning into ruins within moments. Inside the hotel, chaos unfolded. The massive structure, filled with people, began to break apart. Walls crumbled, glass shattered, and debris rained down from above. Mary, who had been helping Julia stay safe, suddenly got hit by falling debris. The impact knocked her unconscious, and she collapsed to the ground, badly injured. Julia, though terrified, refused to leave her behind. She tried to protect Mary in any way she could, dragging her to a safer spot and hiding beside her, hoping to survive. Meanwhile, Chris and Sarah were still stuck in the elevator. Even though the power backup had activated, they couldn't fully escape. The lift had been badly damaged, and chunks of the collapsing building trapped them inside. That's when they heard something that made their hearts sink. Julia was also inside the hotel. Fear gripped them both, but they had no way to reach her. The elevator's walls groaned under the weight of the falling debris, threatening to collapse at any moment. Knowing that even the slightest movement could be fatal, Chris and Sarah held onto each other, waiting and hoping for a way out. At the same time, over at the university, Sam and his girlfriend had managed to survive by hiding under a strong structure. But as they looked around, horror filled their eyes. Many students and professors hadn't been as lucky. Huge chunks of concrete and stone had crashed down on them, leaving them with no chance of escape. The earthquake's intensity grew even stronger, causing massive destruction everywhere. Buildings crumbled, and the city was in chaos. Mary regained consciousness and immediately went to Julia, who was trying to help an injured female worker. The woman was in critical condition, barely holding on. Meanwhile, inside the trapped elevator, Chris and Sarah were slowly creating a way to escape, but suddenly Chris felt a massive jolt. Peering through a small opening, he saw something terrifying. The huge building across from their hotel was collapsing, adding to the destruction. The upper floors of the hotel were also severely weakened and breaking apart. The worst part was that Julia and Mary were on those very floors. As the structure became more unstable, the injured worker lost her balance and fell. Julia and Mary could do nothing to save her. Mary held on to Julia tightly, determined to protect her at all costs. Hearing Julia's screams, Chris realized she was trapped on the top floors, but he also knew something even more terrifying. The entire building's foundation was destroyed. It could collapse at any moment. No matter what, they had to escape before it was too late. Chris and Sarah knew they had no choice but to climb up using the ropes attached to the elevator. Their only hope of saving Julia was to reach the upper floors. As they climbed, the tremors continued shaking the building. Suddenly, a large piece of debris fell and struck Sarah's foot. She winced in pain, struggling to move, but Chris was there to support her. Despite the unbearable situation, they pushed forward, determined to reach their daughter. After a long struggle, Chris spotted an opening on the next floor. However, it was on the opposite side, meaning they had to swing across using a rope. Chris went first, successfully making the jump. But when it was Sarah's turn, disaster struck. The rope she grabbed was already weak. Before Chris could react, the rope snapped. Sarah screamed as she lost her grip and fell into the depths below. Chris watched in horror as his wife plunged to her death. There was nothing he could do. He had just lost Sarah. Pain and grief threatened to consume him, but he didn't have time to mourn. His daughter still needed him. Pushing everything aside, he forced himself to move forward, finally reaching Julia and Mary. Julia was terrified, but when she saw her father, a spark of hope returned to her eyes. Chris reassured her, but their nightmare wasn't over. The floor beneath them suddenly began to crack and collapse. The violent shaking sent Julia tumbling toward the edge. Chris had already lost Sarah. He couldn't lose his daughter too. Without hesitation, he leaped after her, ignoring the danger to himself. Julia landed on a glass panel, but it started cracking under her weight. Chris reached out just in time, grabbing her hand as the glass shattered beneath her. Julia dangled over the abyss, screaming. Mary rushed forward to help. Together, she and Chris pulled Julia up with all their strength. For now, the floor remained stable, no longer breaking apart. Chris noticed something important. The earthquake's intensity was gradually decreasing. It meant that the disaster had finally stopped. Wasting no time, he led Julia and Mary down through a safe path. When they finally reached the ground, they were met with a heartbreaking sight. The entire city lay in ruins. Buildings had crumbled, roads were torn apart, and countless lives had been lost. The destruction was so overwhelming that Chris knew he would never forget this moment for the rest of his life. Mary, exhausted and emotionally drained, collapsed onto her bed. Later, she walked into her father's office and stared at his research with deep sorrow. She realized that Sel had known so much about these earthquakes, yet he had kept it all to himself. The reason? No one had believed him. Sel had decided that he wouldn't share his findings with the world until he had an exact solution. Not even his own daughter, Mary, had known the full truth. Now, as she sat in his office, she remembered him with pain and regret. Meanwhile, Chris, along with Sam and Julia, left the devastated city behind. They headed toward a new home, Chris's secluded house in the middle of the forest. After his divorce, Chris had built this home as a place to escape his loneliness. Little did he know that one day it would become a refuge for his family. The earthquake had taken everything, including the lives of thousands, and worst of all, Sarah. Sam and Julia were heartbroken over losing their mother, but they also realized something. They still had their father, and now they decided to stay with him. But one question remained. Could more earthquakes like this happen again? The possibility was terrifying. That's why Chris made a decision. He would continue Sel's research and develop the technology needed to stop future earthquakes. And with that, our story comes to an end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to let us know in the comments. And if you liked my explanation, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next interesting video. Until then, bye-bye.